the winter of 1979, the Freedom State Forest just outside Fall River, Massachusetts, became the backdrop for a series of brutal murders that gripped the nation. Within just a few months, 3 young women were found dead, bearing striking similarities. All were sex workers from the city's bustling red light district, and all were killed in savage, brutal ways. The cases of Doreen Levesque, Barbara Raposa, and Karen Marsden soon spiraled into national headlines. The ritualistic aspects of the murders, combined with the notorious reputation of the nearby Freedom State Forest for satanic activities, only fanned the flames. A satanic cult, ritual human sacrifice, and even a pimp who proclaimed himself to be the son of the devil. Each detail added to the firestorm of public outrage and fear. If this sounds like something out of a horror movie script, it shouldn't. These cases were all too real. The subsequent official trials locked 3 individuals behind bars for decades, all based on these accusations. According to the official story, justice was served in at least 2 of these cases. The public was assured that all was well and that there was nothing to fear. Could all of it be true? Was justice really served in the case of the Fall River murders, or was there more to it than meets the eye? For decades leading up to the murders, Fall River had been plagued by violence, prostitution, and drugs. Yet this case was unlike anything that had come before. A city that had long endured gang violence and poverty had never before witnessed brutality of this nature. As details of these cases began to swirl around town, the public was captivated, and the story quickly spread across the nation. Now, before delving into the details of the murders, we need to zoom out and take a higher-level view of Fall River at the tail end of the 70s, along with the environment in which these women lived. All 3 women were sex workers working the streets in a small area around the Bedford Street red light district. Once known for its factories and mills, the city had by that point become notorious for its booming sex work network. The police were overwhelmed by the sheer scale of the problem, and judges were hesitant to hand down prison sentences to the women involved, given the extremely high recidivism rate after release. By the late 70s, Fall River was effectively importing prostitution, with women traveling from surrounding cities like Providence, cities that enforced stricter measures, to work the streets. As one of the police officers who worked on the case recalled in a recent interview, quote, "There were so many girls working the streets those days that there were traffic jams on Friday and Saturday nights." In the Bedford Street area, the man running the show was Carl Drew. At just 26, he carried with him a troubled past that had put him at odds with law enforcement from an early age. Born into extreme poverty in New Hampshire, he endured a viciously abusive father who frequently beat him during his childhood. By early adolescence, he recalled reaching a breaking point. One day he simply had had enough and knocked his father, quote, on his ass, and then he left home for good. It wasn't long before he came into trouble with the law. This landed him in jail at around the age of 16 for holding up a convenience store. However, he soon returned to the streets and developed an interest in Fall River's nightlife. Sensing an opportunity, he began building a network of sex work in his early 20s, earning a reputation for his raging temper and propensity for violence. And this is where Robin Murphy enters the picture, who was then only 16. Although she never worked directly with Drew, the two would eventually operate in a similar sphere on Bedford Street, overseeing a large number of sex workers. If you assumed that a 16-year-old couldn't handle herself in such an environment, well, you have clearly never met Murphy. Tough as nails, she spoke the same language of violence as Drew. Despite not being particularly close or fond of one another, they eventually learned to coexist. As the 70s drew to a close, the pair reigned over the city's underworld. Yet, as with so much in life, all good things must come to an end, and the abruptness of that downfall would come as a shock to everybody. In the early morning of October the 13th, 1979, 2 joggers discovered the lifeless body of a teenage girl under the bleachers at Diamond Regional Vocational High School in Fall River. The scene was unlike anything they could have imagined. Fall River, as you might have gathered by now, was not a city where violent crime was common. When such cases did occur, they typically involved muggings, hit and runs, or similar incidents. However, the scene before these joggers that fateful morning was entirely different. The girl had become unrecognizable, her skull crushed by a large blunt object. She had been bound, her clothing partially removed, and subjected to sadistic torture before her death. Shocked by what they had witnessed, the joggers scrambled to find the nearest payphone to report their discovery. Fall River police were equally stupefied upon arriving at the scene. None of them had ever encountered a murder quite like this before. It took several days for investigators to identify the victim as 17-year-old Doreen Levesque, a troubled teen who had a poor relationship with her family and who, after running away, had become entangled in the city's sex work network. It wouldn't take long before word would spread throughout the city and people grew nervous. The news sent even stronger shockwaves through the local network of sex workers who were all too familiar with the violence routinely directed against them. Shortly after the discovery, a man named Andy Maltais came forward to the police claiming that two of his friends had knowledge of the murder. Eager to gather as much information as possible, the police urged him to bring them in. Within a day or two young women were sitting in front of the investigators. The first was Robin Murphy, who we met in the previous chapter. The other was her associate, Karen Marsden. The two took radically divergent approaches. Murphy remained cool and said almost nothing, sitting back and letting Marsden do most of the talking. Meanwhile, Marsden was completely terrified. Although she did not specify exactly what she had witnessed, she repeatedly warned that she would be killed if she revealed any details. One thing stood out immediately. She was deeply afraid of Carl Drew, naming him as the person who would kill her if news got out that she was talking. Marsden's insistence that Drew threatened her life would ultimately play a crucial role in the investigation. However, the police found themselves with little to work on as she provided no specifics or tangible evidence, refusing to even accept placement in protective custody. Meanwhile, as these events unfolded, speculation began to ripple throughout the city, with many linking Doreen's death to something far more sinister: demonic forces. The nearby Freetown State Forest had long been rumored to be the stage for an unholy trifecta: gang activity, sexual violence, and satanic cult worship, complete with altars, black masses, and animal sacrifice. Although details were murky, the forest had earned its notorious reputation. Just a few years prior, it had been the scene where a 15-year-old Mary Lou Aruda was murdered. Additionally, several incidents of mutilated animal corpses emerging as if sacrificed in a satanic black mass only deepened the shadow of suspicion. Could Doreen's killing possibly be related? Well, many believed that possibility to be very, very real. Within the next month, another woman working the streets in Fall River went missing. On the night of November 7th, 1979, Barbara Raposa failed to pick up her young son from the babysitter and did not return to her father's home. Like Levesque, Raposa had endured a challenging upbringing. By this point, she was a 22-year-old single mother battling a drug addiction. With few other options in the city, she turned to prostitution to support her lifestyle. It took 2.5 months before her body was found. By then, both the police and the community had resigned themselves to the likely truth. Barbara had been killed. Anyone who knew her understood that she loved her son with all her heart and would have never abandoned him so callously. On a brutally cold January day, hunters in the Freetown State Forest discovered her body partially buried in the snow. Evidently, she'd been there for a long time, her body having frozen after partially decomposing in the winter chill. The similarities to the murder of Doreen Levesque a few months earlier were striking. Raposa's hands had been bound, and she had been bludgeoned to death on the skull with a blunt object, likely a rock. However, this tragedy was not isolated. Less than a month later, the third and final young woman in this devastating series of crimes would vanish, never to be seen again. Karen Marsden, who had long feared for her life amid these disturbing events, spoke with the police one final time on February the 8th, 1980. Despite being offered protective custody and an opportunity to leave the city, she refused. Instead, she insisted on going to St. Mary's Cathedral to speak with a priest. Unable to detain her against her will, the police simply drove her to her destination and dropped her off. Marsden would never be seen again. The following day, her grandmother reported her missing to the police and provided a name for a follow-up: Carl Drew. It took weeks before any trace of Marsden turned up, and when it did, it was the most horrific discovery yet. All that was found were fragments of her skull, traces of hair, tatters of her clothing, and a blood-stained rock. Piecing together these murders was set to become the greatest challenge of these detectives' careers. As the cases continued to mount, they knew they needed to act before another young woman went missing. But what did they have on these cases at that point? The first murder, that of Doreen Levesque, left the investigators with little to go on. Although her body was dumped near a high school, there were no witnesses to the crime. Local police sent the rock found beside her body to Washington, D.C. in hopes of lifting fingerprints off it, but none were found. No one saw her get into a car the night she went missing, though a few people vaguely recalled seeing her working the streets that evening. Interestingly, Levesque had made it clear that she wanted nothing to do with the protection offered by Drew or Murphy. She was on her own and generally made an effort to steer clear of their territory. However, the city is not large, and she remained close enough to be seen as competition. Could this have been a motive? The few leads they initially had were all problematic. Murphy said very little when questioned about them at the time. Marsden clearly knew something, but they couldn't get her to talk. She was afraid for her life, and her fear seemed to point back at Carl Drew. Raposa's death had slightly more to go on. The same man who had earlier brought Murphy and Marsden to light in the aftermath of Levesque's killing, Andy Maltais, became particularly central to this case. Maltais had been romantically involved with Raposa, and there were strong suspicions he might have been the father of her child. Their relationship was notoriously volatile, and at the time of her death, they were squarely in the off-again phase. Maltais increasingly made himself a suspect by constantly inserting himself into the investigation. What might have initially been seen as a natural desire to stay informed about the fate of a loved one gradually evolved into a daily routine of stopping by the police station, each time offering new suggestions and possibilities concerning where she might have been or what could have happened to her. His constant involvement ultimately transformed him from a person of interest into the lead suspect, when one day he arrived holding a Bible and remarked that he had once been with Satan, but he was now with God. He claimed to have experienced a vision in which two angels revealed to him the murder of Raposa. The story he then presented to the police was as follows. As he floated at a treetop level, he saw a man carrying a woman before dropping her into the ground. Maltais recognized her as Raposa. The man walked away briefly to retrieve an object. When he returned, he stood behind Raposa, lifted the object, a rock, over his head, and struck her repeatedly in the face while screaming insults and cursing in broken English. The victim pleaded, "Andy, help me. Andy, forgive me." In response, the murderer snarled, "Andy is not going to help you anymore." Maltais explained that the motive for the murder was a love affair. The killer had been infatuated with Raposa, and she had double-crossed him. Andy's fate was sealed when he accompanied the police to the murder scene. As he walked through the area, he repeatedly told officers that he was getting vibes and visions, and was heard more than once remarking, "I think they've got me now." At one point, he abruptly stopped, pointed at a specific tree, and said, "That's where the body was." He also identified a spot on the ground a short distance away, adding, "That's where her head was." An officer present when Raposa's body was first discovered confirmed that these were indeed the locations where her remains were found. Unsurprisingly, Fall River police arrested him, charged him with first-degree murder on February the 7th, 1980. While it appeared that Raposa's case was nearing a conclusion, the same could not be said for the other two women. At this point, the only lead was Marsden, who was not cooperating and soon vanished herself. Although she admitted to knowing who had killed Doreen, she refused to provide any further details aside from confessing her deep fear of Drew. The situation shifted following Marsden's disappearance shortly after Maltais was arrested. Marsden had last been seen entering St. Mary's, and with no body recovered, the police had even less evidence to work with than in Doreen's case. Nevertheless, the same circle of suspects remained under scrutiny: Robin Murphy, Carl Drew, and Andy Maltais, who all had known associations with Marsden. The discovery of part of Marsden's skull in a wooded area just outside Fall River allowed the police to officially escalate the investigation from a missing persons case to a full-blown murder inquiry. Their investigative efforts intensified on multiple fronts, most notably through the decision to secure a wiretap on Robin Murphy herself. Not long after the wiretap began, police caught Murphy confessing to Marsden's killing during a phone call with a friend. This was not a one-off slip of the tongue, but a detailed, first-person account of the events of that night. Murphy was deeply involved in the incident, but she was not acting alone. The wiretap on Robin Murphy eventually blew the case wide open, leading not only to her arrest, but also to the conviction of Carl Drew and Andy Maltais. Facing at least one charge of first-degree murder for Karen Marsden's death, an indictment in Massachusetts that precludes the possibility of parole and virtually ensures a life sentence, she quickly negotiated a plea deal. In exchange for providing information about what really happened, prosecutors agreed to reduce her charge to second-degree murder, thereby opening the possibility of parole in the future. Although she would serve many years behind bars, this deal at least offered her a chance to one day having a life outside of prison. The details Murphy provided were beyond what anyone had imagined. She possessed intimate knowledge not only of Marsden's murder, but of all three cases. Every thread led back to Carl Drew, a man far more sinister than anyone had suspected. He was not merely a violent pimp, he was a practicing Satanist who coerced the sex workers under his control into participating in his ceremonies and sacrifices. Now, it's important to remember that during this time, America was gripped by what became known as the Satanic Panic, a period marked by widespread fear of ritual abuse, occult activity, and alleged underground satanic cults. Sensational media coverage and the rise of groups like Anton LaVey's Church of Satan created an environment in which even unverified accusations were readily accepted as fact. Moreover, the nearby Freetown State Forest, with its notorious reputation for crime and the occult, made these threats feel all the more real throughout the city. While much of it was, in hindsight, overblown, there were still those who used the rise of Satanism as a cover for nefarious acts. This was especially true in the Freetown State Forest, where criminals enjoyed vast, secluded areas to carry out their activities unchecked. Over time, the situation escalated to the point where the Freetown Police Department assigned Detective Lieutenant Alan Alves to focus specifically on investigating alleged satanic crimes in the area. Murphy's claims of further satanic cult activity were hardly stretching anyone's imagination at the time. Drew had evolved into a hardcore, dedicated Satanist during his years running the streets in Fall River, drawing his followers ever deeper into initiation ceremonies before they could work for him. Many of these women found themselves in desperate circumstances and had little choice but to comply. While the legitimacy of his beliefs has been questioned, prosecutors largely settled on a dual-track approach. They contended that Drew engaged in satanic rituals both out of genuine belief, he allegedly called himself the son of Lucifer, and to enjoy the more secular effect of terrifying the young women around him. As newcomers to his organization, both Murphy and Marsden were required to participate in his satanic initiation ritual. That night, his plans went far beyond the routine sacrifice of an animal. He intended to elevate the ceremony by offering up another human. According to Murphy's testimony, Doreen Levesque was killed by Carl Drew on October the 13th, 1979, serving both as an offering to the devil and as a means of baptizing Robin and Karen into his cult. Both individuals were present, forced to witness the brutal ritual unfold. Levesque had been specifically targeted because she was working alone and had refused the protection offered by Drew and his cult. Seen as competition, her elimination was a calculated move to keep his share of the market uncontested. Murphy further testified to the police and in court that Drew was also responsible for Marsden's death. Although Levesque's killing was abnormally brutal, it paled in comparison to Marsden's fate. Her body was dismembered and scattered across the area in a deliberate effort to hide the evidence. Murphy's accounts included horrifying, detailed descriptions of the sadistic, ritualistic acts of barbarism performed on the victims, leaving both prosecutors and juries in shocked disbelief. Drew had underestimated Marsden, she told prosecutors. His original plan was to use Levesque's sacrifice to terrify Karen into never crossing him again, and it had achieved its goal, albeit too effectively. The girl had become a nervous wreck, quickly evolving into exactly what no one in that predicament ever wants to be seen as: a loose end, too emotionally volatile to be trusted. By the time Drew learned that Marsden was talking to the police, he knew what he had to do. Marsden knew too much, as she had even admitted to those around her, and she needed to be silenced. Drew and Murphy would lure Marsden into their car and drive deep into the Freetown State Forest. By the time they reached their destination, things had taken a turn for the worse. Murphy, who at the time was in a romantic relationship with Marsden, pulled her from the car by her hair as she screamed. Murphy then gave lengthy, specific accounts of what transpired afterward. While the exact details are absolutely too gory to recount here, she described events involving everything from torture and decapitations to acts of necrophilia. Murphy consistently maintained that she had been coerced by Drew out of fear for her own life. Aware of what he was capable of and the consequences of crossing him, she claimed she had little choice in the matter. Despite her assertions of coercion and her attempts to downplay her culpability in these brutal killings, she still pleaded guilty to a reduced charge of second-degree murder. And then there was Raposa's case. As it happened, Murphy was there as well. She rode as a passenger in Maltais' car deep into Freetown State Forest, a journey that by now hardly needs to be explained as a bad idea. At that time, Raposa and Maltais were separated, a fact that clearly left Maltais disgruntled. The atmosphere in the car started off tense, and only worsened the deeper they ventured into the forest. Murphy could only hope that this trip wouldn't end in the way she feared. After the car stopped in a desolate spot deep within the forest, Murphy stayed inside, listening to music in an effort to drown out the sound of Maltais forcing himself on Raposa. That day, he was determined to kill her, sooner rather than later. He made several trips back to his trunk to retrieve different tools for the deed. Murphy's testimony served as the linchpin in the prosecution's case. Thanks to her account, guilty verdicts for first-degree murder were secured against both Carl Drew and Andy Maltais, both of whom were subsequently sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. In return for her testimony, the prosecution reduced the charge against Murphy to second-degree murder, to which she eventually pleaded guilty. By the time the trials concluded, Robin Murphy was just 18 years old, yet she already had an astonishing track record. She had ascended the ranks on the streets of Fall River, standing on par with infamous figures like pimps such as Carl Drew. She had been present at the scenes of 3 separate murders, was deeply involved in the Satanic cult, and had served as the star witness in multiple murder trials. However, once these men were sent to jail, questions began to arise concerning the truthfulness of her testimony. Could it be that this 18-year-old had manipulated the Fall River Police, the district attorney, and the judicial system in the same way that she had navigated the streets? Cracks began to appear in the case from the very start. Something about Murphy's testimony just wasn't quite right. She somehow showed up at all 3 murder scenes with 2 different killers and managed to get away unscathed each time. While she might argue that she was following Drew's orders, why would she have ridden in a car with Maltais deep into the forest, especially given his long history of abusing her? She had also testified that during Raposa's death, she stayed in Maltais' car listening to music, too afraid to get out and hoping the stereo would drown out the sounds of what was happening just feet away. She further stated that Andy returned to the trunk on more than one occasion to retrieve tools used in the killing. At that time, cars did not have inner release buttons for the trunk. You had to physically take the key to the trunk and unlock it by inserting the key into the lock. This detail already casts doubt on Murphy's testimony, as there was only one key available, and according to her account, it was in the ignition. Despite this, Maltais had a sordid history of sexual deviancy that rendered him a deeply unsympathetic character in the eyes of the jury. Remember, he was accused of exploiting children as young as 11, including Murphy herself. However, this background does not automatically establish guilt in Raposa's murder. Could a jury have overlooked these discrepancies influenced by his deeply unpleasant past? Aside from Murphy's testimony, there was no first-hand account placing Maltais at the scene. The credibility of her testimony from the early 80s came under intense scrutiny roughly 2 decades later at her initial parole hearing. During that hearing, she admitted to the judge that she had fabricated large parts of her account, especially those involving Drew. It would take several years and several more rounds of recanting before her story was ultimately finalized. She was not present at any of the murders. Various factors, including pressure from the police and the fear of receiving a life sentence without the possibility of parole during her teenage years, led her to invent many details in her testimony. The police had already made Drew a leading suspect in Marsden's death, particularly given how forceful she had suggested that Drew was capable of being. The people in Fall River and the surrounding communities were terrified by a series of brutal consecutive killings. Given this atmosphere of fear, is it so unlikely that the police might have pressured Murphy to embellish what she had witnessed? As for Maltais, Murphy explained in a 2021 docuseries on the case that she hadn't fabricated that part of her story, not because of what he had done to her when she was young, but rather to ensure he would never be able to do the same to anyone else. In a way, she achieved her goal. After being convicted for Raposa's murder, Maltais spent the rest of his life behind bars and died in 1998. Even though she wasn't present at the scene of the killing, she, along with many others, remain convinced that he was ultimately responsible. Now, let's take a step back for a moment. Murphy was undoubtedly the star witness in the conviction of both Maltais and Drew. Given that she later recanted her testimony, doesn't that suggest there should be a retrial? And if neither of these 2 men was actually responsible for the killings, what might have become of those 3 women all those years ago? We may never know for sure what actually happened to those 3 girls. The killings took place nearly half a century ago, and one of the accused, Andy Maltais, died years ago. Nevertheless, several alternative theories have emerged. One in particular has gained traction following a 2021 Epix docuseries investigation. Yet none of the theories are without their flaws. Number 1. The official story is a lie. The Commonwealth of Massachusetts found itself in an awkward situation after Murphy officially recanted her testimony. Lacking any DNA evidence from the scene, investigators had relied heavily on Murphy's account of the ordeal. Despite Drew's repeated calls for a retrial in light of these recantations, the Massachusetts Supreme Judicial Court denied his request, ruling that Murphy's original testimony was credible while her later statements were unreliable. Consequently, this did not meet the threshold of new evidence. In the following years, even the only other individuals who had testified against Drew on circumstantial grounds, including a girlfriend of his who at the time originally claimed in court that he had given her a ring belonging to Marsden, later recanted their testimony. Adding to Drew's troubles, he was represented at his original trial by an underqualified lawyer. Unable to afford legal counsel, he was assigned a public defender who not only had no experience with murder cases, but would never handle one again. This inexperience enabled the prosecution to pull off quite a feat in Drew's trial for the murder of Karen Marsden. They managed to introduce details from Levesque's case against him, even though he was never formally charged in connection with that murder. While a more experienced defense attorney might have succeeded in keeping the details of Levesque's murder out of the jury's sight, Drew had no such luck. The prosecution understood that convicting Drew of murdering both women would be a formidable challenge. They were already facing an uphill battle in securing a conviction for Marsden's death, so they opted to charge him solely in her case. By doing so, they managed to repurpose the insufficient evidence from Levesque's case against him. Ironically, it likely would have worked out better for him if they'd charged him with both murders. Murphy, however, accused the prosecution of pressuring her into testifying against Drew. Although they were within their rights to offer lesser charges in exchange for her cooperation, Murphy now testifies that she was coerced into saying what they wanted her to know rather than what she truly knew. Given Murphy's long track record of manipulation and deceit, it is difficult to distinguish the truth from her fabrications. Number 2. Maltais did all three. The 2021 docuseries investigation strongly hints that Maltais was responsible for all three women's deaths, and it raises several convincing points. To begin with, the timing and method of each death was strikingly similar. All three victims were sex workers from Fall River, all were ultimately killed by blunt force trauma to the skull, and all were found with their hands bound using thin white rope. Interestingly, Maltais was known to have white fishing line in his car that closely resembled the rope used in the crimes. One has to wonder, did two separate individuals really decide to kill in such a brutal and identical manner at the same time? Unbeknownst to the prosecution at the time, Maltais had already been incarcerated. In 1957, he was arrested in the Freetown State Forest for picking up girls from various high schools in Fall River and bringing them there against their will. While such behavior is hard to imagine today, cases like this were more likely to be overlooked in the pre-internet era when centralized criminal record systems were lacking. Before her disappearance, Marsden had reportedly confided in her grandmother that Andy had threatened her. Aware that he was becoming a suspect in the Raposa killing, she had mentioned that if Andy were arrested for that crime, Karen's safety would be in jeopardy. In support of this theory, events unfolded exactly as predicted. Marsden was present when Maltais killed Levesque, prompting him to eliminate her once the police attention shifted his way. But how could Maltais have targeted Marsden if he was already in custody? Well, this is where the docuseries Smoking Gun comes into play. After being arrested for Raposa's murder, he was released on bail just hours before Marsden went missing. Given Andy's close personal relationship with Raposa, authorities initially believed the incident to be a one-off crime of passion. However, this theory is hardly bulletproof. There's no physical evidence placing Maltais or anyone else at any of these crime scenes. While his background was undeniably terrible and sadistic, these killings do not distinctly match his usual modus operandi. The revelations that he was raping young women as far back as 1957 further underscore the inconsistency in his approach. He would lure potential victims, earn their trust, and then strike. In over 20 years of doing this, however, he had never killed anyone. While he did have a motive to kill Raposa in a fit of passion, what about the other two women? Although people can escalate their behavior, such a rapid shift does seem unusual. FBI profiling research shows that sexual offenders who kill typically exhibit homicidal tendencies early on rather than abruptly transitioning later. Furthermore, most serial offenders, including pedophiles, adhere to a relatively consistent modus operandi. True to form, Maltais had established his method. By the time he was arrested in his 40s, he had been sexually abusing underage girls for decades. Perhaps the biggest flaw in this theory is how afraid Marsden was of Drew. Much of the argument rests on the premise that she was present at the scene when Levesque was killed, which supposedly made her a target for Maltais for having seen too much. Once he became a suspect in one of the murders, he couldn't risk losing his control over her. He had to strike while he was still out on bail. If this was the case, then why was Marsden so deathly afraid of Drew while discussing the situation with the police? Drew had an undeniable reputation for violence, yet if she had just witnessed Maltais brutally torture and kill a girl, it seems unlikely that her concern would focus on anyone other than him. While this is not an exhaustive list of possibilities or alternative hypotheticals, it provides at least a broad overview of what occurred during and shortly after the murder of those three women. Number 3. Murphy was more involved. Being present at the scene of 3 separate murders in just a few months is one extraordinary streak. In all of her original stories, she was there, though either not involved or forced, under the threat of losing her own life, to participate. Could it be that Murphy knew her original story would have difficulty convincing a parole board and therefore recanted her testimony? She maintains that her original account was fabricated, but that stance raises several questions. You probably recall how a wiretap caught her confessing a murder to a friend before the police had any evidence against her, let alone had charged her with murder. Why would she invent details that implicated herself in the murder of a woman with whom she was involved? Furthermore, if she was more involved in the murders than she has admitted, but later felt remorse for falsely, or at the very least exaggerating Drew's role in them, this recantation might serve both purposes. She was not present at any of the killings, so she should be free. And since she has no knowledge of Drew actually committing the murders, he too should be set free. This case inevitably leaves us with more questions than answers. Given the significant time that has passed since these crimes occurred, and considering that Maltais has been dead for over 2 decades, it seems unlikely that we will ever know exactly what happened to these women. Carl Drew has maintained his innocence in both cases since the day he was convicted. He has repeatedly petitioned for a retrial, only to have his requests denied time and again. Although Marsden's fear of him in the lead up to his disappearance is striking, it must be noted that almost every piece of evidence, primarily witness testimony, used against Drew during his original trial has since collapsed. The star witness, Murphy, completely recanted her testimony about him, and his girlfriend at the time, Lee Johnson, also retracted her statements. Nevertheless, he remains behind bars today based largely on that same discredited testimony. Murphy, for her part, was released on parole in 2004, although she eventually returned to prison after violating its terms. Earlier this year, she was granted parole a second time. She maintains that Drew was not responsible for the deaths of either woman. No one has ever been charged with the murder of 17-year-old Doreen Levesque. To this day, no additional remains of Karen Marsden have been recovered. Despite the case receiving widespread attention, from the headlines and widely circulated confessions to whispers of satanic sacrifices, the reality remains chillingly simple. 3 women are dead. Doreen Levesque, Barbara Raposa, Karen Marsden. Each was young, vulnerable, and brutally murdered. Even though Andy Maltais and Carl Drew have been convicted, there is a possibility that justice was never truly served for these victims. For the families, this is evident. No charges were ever brought in the murder of Doreen Levesque, and Karen Marsden's body remains unfound. In the end, it may not have taken a cult to destroy these lives, only fear, a sensational lie, and a justice system unwilling to look back. Thank you for watching.